The castle sat on the edge of the cliff, its dark stones blending with the twilight that never seemed to fade. The wind howled through the jagged towers, carrying whispers that spoke of old curses and broken promises. It was a kingdom that breathed power, fear, and magic, and at its center sat the Alpha King, a ruler whose presence commanded obedience, awe, and an almost dangerous admiration. Lady Alara, newly brought to the court, stepped carefully into the grand hall. Her heart beat faster with each echoing step. She had heard of the Alpha King's reputation, of his dominance over both men and magic, but seeing him in person was unlike anything she had imagined. He did not merely walk. He moved with purpose, as if the ground itself bowed to his weight. The king's eyes met hers as she approached. They were dark, endless pools, and they seemed to look through her, straight into her thoughts. He studied her with a mixture of curiosity and authority that made her knees tremble. Yet there was something more, a flicker of loneliness beneath his command, a shadow of pain she could almost feel. "You are late," the king said, his voice low and resonant. "Do you not respect the rules of this house?" Alara straightened her spine. "I apologize, Your Majesty. The roads were treacherous." He did not respond immediately, only tilted his head and continued to study her. The silence was heavier than the wind outside. She felt the weight of his presence pressing against her, demanding acknowledgement, submission, and yet something else, something she could not name. "You will learn quickly," he said finally, his tone softer but no less commanding. "In this castle nothing is given freely. You take what you desire, and you survive if you can endure the cost." Alara's pulse quickened. She had been trained to face danger, to speak boldly, yet a chill ran down her spine. This was a different kind of trial. This was not swords or shields. It was the trial of will, heart, and spirit. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Alara watched the king rule his court with iron control. Servants moved swiftly at his command. Knights bowed with precise respect, and whispers of fear and awe followed him like shadows. Yet at night she glimpsed a different side, a king who lingered at the edge of the balcony, staring at the horizon with eyes that seemed to search for something lost. One evening, the queen's chambers were filled with the soft light of lanterns, casting golden reflections across the dark walls. The king entered without announcement, as was his habit. Alara felt her heart quicken, though she told herself she must remain calm. "Do you know why I brought you here?" he asked, stepping closer, the faint scent of iron and smoke following him. "I do not, Your Majesty," she replied, steadying her voice. "Because I see strength in you," he said, circling her slowly, as if measuring her presence. "But strength alone is not enough. You must endure the shadows, the tests, the demands of this place." Alara's eyes followed him, noting the subtle power in his movements. There was danger here, but also an unspoken invitation, a challenge she felt drawn to, though she did not yet understand why. "You will take every inch," he murmured, "until you cannot walk, until you feel the weight of this kingdom press upon you and still—" "Stand!" Her breath caught at his words. There was no threat in his tone, only certainty. It was not a promise of pain, but of transformation. He did not merely demand obedience. He demanded commitment, presence, and a courage she was only beginning to discover within herself. That night she lay awake, the king's words echoing in her mind. She had faced battles before, but nothing like this. This was not a fight against swords or armies. It was a fight for her own heart, her own limits. Could she endure the Alpha King and survive the storm of his world? Could she take every inch of his presence, his power, and still remain herself? In the days that followed, the king tested her in subtle ways. He would command her presence at court during moments of tension, watching her reactions with eyes that seemed to pierce through the layers of her courage. He spoke of the past, hinting at betrayals that had scarred his heart, and she began to understand that his dominance was a shield, forged from pain and solitude. Yet even as she felt the weight of his scrutiny, there were moments when his guard seemed to falter, a fleeting glance when he thought she was unaware, a softness in his voice when he spoke of the land he had sworn to protect. These glimpses were brief, but they were enough to stir something within her, a desire to reach beyond fear and command, to see the man beneath the legend. One evening, as the moon cast silver light over the castle walls, the king summoned her to the throne room. The air was thick with enchantment. Shadows shifted as if alive. He stood near the throne, tall and unyielding, his cloak billowing like smoke around him. "Walk with me," he commanded. Alara obeyed, stepping beside him as he moved through the hallways. Each step echoed with authority and anticipation. The closer she came to him, the more she felt the pull of his presence, not just power, but something magnetic, something that reached for the part of her that longed for understanding, for connection. They reached a balcony overlooking the jagged cliffs. The wind whipped around them, tugging at her hair and cloak. The king's gaze fell upon her. "You feel the wind," he said softly. "It carries freedom, danger, choices. You are free to turn away at any moment, but freedom comes with cost, and courage. Courage demands everything." Elara swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She had always believed courage was standing firm in battle. Now she realized, courage was standing before this man, this king, and not fleeing from the pull of something she could not yet name. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, yet not touching. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment the castle, the wind, the world itself seemed to fall away. "You will take every inch," he repeated, this time not as a command but as a truth, "and I will see if your heart endures." Elara's breath caught. She did not know what would come next, but she felt the spark of something ancient and profound. Connection, challenge, and the beginning of understanding. She realized that the Alpha King was not merely a ruler to fear, but a force to meet, to learn from, and perhaps to love. The wind howled around them, tugging at their cloaks, carrying whispers of curses and secrets. Elara stood firm, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the castle, she felt the stirrings of destiny, of a bond that would demand every ounce of strength and courage she had. And then, without warning, the king stepped closer still, and his voice, low and intense, carried a promise she could not ignore. "Tonight you begin," he said, "and nothing will ever be the same again." Elara shivered, not from fear, but from the weight of what was to come. She understood in that moment that she had entered a world where power, desire, and destiny intertwined. She had stepped into the shadowed throne, and there was no turning back. As the moonlight spilled across the balcony, their eyes locked, and the wind seemed to carry a warning and an invitation in the same breath. The Alpha King's gaze promised challenge, transformation, and something far more dangerous. A heart that would reach for hers no matter the cost. And in that instant, Elara realized the truth. To survive, to endure, and perhaps to love, she would have to take every inch of this castle, of this world, and of the king himself. The night deepened, and the castle seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the trials to come. Elara did not flinch. She would stand. She would face the shadows, and she would discover in the process the power hidden within her own heart. The Alpha King watched her silently, a mixture of command and something softer in his eyes. And the castle, ancient and restless, seemed to whisper, "The game has begun." Days turned into weeks, and the castle seemed to breathe around Elara. Shadows lingered longer in its corridors, and the walls whispered secrets only the king and those bold enough to listen could hear. Elara had begun to understand the weight of her new life. Every choice, every glance, every word carried meaning in a kingdom where power and desire were entwined. The Alpha King, as always, moved like a force of nature. His presence filled the halls, commanding obedience without the need for raised voice or gesture. Yet with Elara he seemed to shift. The harshness softened at times, replaced by something almost fragile, as if her mere presence reminded him that he was more than a ruler. One afternoon, she found herself in the hidden library, a place of ancient tomes and forbidden knowledge. Dust danced in the sunlight that filtered through the tall windows, and the smell of old parchment filled her senses. She ran her fingers along the spines of books, each one holding stories of kings and queens, curses and magic, love and betrayal. It was there she discovered hints of the king's curse. A prophecy spoke of an immortal ruler who could not trust, who would drain those he loved unless they met him with courage and heart. Elara read the words aloud in a whisper, her pulse quickening. She realized that her attraction to the king was more than danger. It was the beginning of a test she did not fully understand. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see the king, tall and imposing, watching her from the doorway. His eyes, dark and endless, held a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "You found the prophecy," he said softly. I did," Elara admitted. "It speaks of you." He stepped closer, the weight of his presence pressing against her. "And what do you think of it?" Elara hesitated. I think It is frightening, but also, it explains much. The king studied her, and for a moment his usual command was tempered by something softer. It is frightening, he agreed. And yet it is my truth. To love, to trust, to be vulnerable, these are not gifts I can give easily. They are burdens for both me and those who follow my heart. Elara felt a pang of sympathy. She had seen strength in many forms, but the king's power carried a loneliness that even the bravest could not endure without fear. And yet she could not turn away. Something in her stirred, an empathy that urged her to reach for the man behind the legend. "You are not like the others," he said after a pause, his voice low and deliberate. "You do not flinch. You do not fear me entirely. That intrigues me." Elara's cheeks warmed. She wanted to speak, to deny the effect he had on her, but the words faltered. There was truth in his observation, a truth she could not escape. She had felt the pull of his presence since the day she arrived, and now she understood that it was more than power. It was the essence of him, raw and unyielding, yet deeply wounded. Over the following days, their encounters became more intricate, a delicate dance of control, tension, and curiosity. The king would test her resolve in subtle ways, requiring her presence at court during moments of strain, observing her interactions with the nobles, noting the slightest flicker of fear or courage. Elara, in turn, learned to navigate these challenges with care, responding to his dominance not with submission, but with a quiet strength that surprised him. One evening, the castle was quiet, the wind whispering through the towers like a soft voice. The king summoned her to the training yard, a place of stone and shadows where knights honed their skills. He stood waiting, the last rays of sunlight catching the edges of his cloak, making him seem almost unreal. "You will train with me," he said simply. Elara nodded, though her heart raced. She had trained in swordsmanship before, but not with a man whose presence could unbalance her with a glance. They sparred, their movements precise, each strike and parry a test of skill and understanding. Yet beneath the physical exertion was an unspoken tension, a push and pull that neither could deny. The king's movements were relentless, but he held back enough to allow her to match him, to test herself against his strength without being crushed. And in those moments, Elara felt a connection deeper than words, a bond forged in respect, challenge, and an undeniable attraction. After the sparring ended, the king approached her. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes spoke volumes. "You endure well," he said. "But endurance alone is not enough. You must understand me as I must understand you. Only then can we survive this together." Elara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Their lives were intertwined now, not by choice but by fate and the unyielding pull of power and heart. She realized that to navigate this castle, to survive the Alpha King, she would need more than courage. She would need insight, patience, and a willingness to face the shadows within both herself and him. That night she wandered the castle alone, seeking the quiet that seemed to slip through her fingers in the presence of the king. The corridors were dark and silent, the air heavy with magic and history. She paused by a window overlooking the cliffs, watching the waves crash below, the moonlight shimmering across the jagged rocks. A soft voice broke the silence. "You think too much." Elara turned to see the king standing behind her, as silent and commanding as ever. Yet this time there was no threat, only observation. "I cannot help it," she replied. "There is so much to understand here, about this kingdom, about you." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, yet not touching. "And yet," he said, "there is something you must understand first. To love me, to survive me, to walk beside me, you must take every part of me, every shadow, every burden. You must endure without faltering. Do you think you can do that?" Elara met his gaze steadily. "I do not know," she admitted, "but I want to try." For a moment the wind seemed to still. The castle held its breath. The king studied her, and then without warning he reached out, placing a single hand near hers, not touching, but close enough that she felt the promise in the space between them. "You are brave," he said softly. "Bravery alone will not save you, but it will allow you to walk with me. And perhaps it may allow you to reach what no one else has." Elara's heart pounded. She understood that the Alpha King's power was more than physical or magical. It was a force of will, of spirit, and only those who met it with courage and understanding could hope to survive. And yet she also felt something more. A spark of connection, a thread of trust beginning to form between them. The days that followed were filled with challenges, both subtle and overt. The king introduced her to the court's politics, the web of alliances and rivalries that stretched through the kingdom like a shadow. He tested her insight, her patience, and her ability to read both people and situations. And in every encounter, he observed her as closely as she observed him, measuring her strength, her heart, and her capacity for endurance. One night, as a storm raged outside, the king summoned her to the highest tower. Lightning illuminated the sky, casting fleeting shadows across the stone walls. The wind tore at their cloaks, carrying the scent of rain and electricity. "Do you understand what is at stake?" he asked, his voice almost drowned by the storm. Ilara nodded. "I think I am beginning to." He stepped closer, and for the first time he allowed his vulnerability to show. Not weakness, but a glimpse of the man behind the crown. "This kingdom of my power, it consumes those I care for. Only those who meet it with courage and heart can survive. Only those who understand me fully can stand beside me." Ilara felt the truth of his words resonate within her. She understood now that loving him was not a simple matter of heart or desire. It was a test of spirit, of endurance, of willingness to face shadows both within him and herself. The king's gaze softened, and he extended a hand, not commanding, not demanding, but inviting. "Will you walk with me through this darkness?" Ilara took a deep breath, her heart steady despite the storm. She reached out, taking his hand, and in that moment she felt a connection stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. It was a bond forged in courage, understanding, and the first spark of trust. And as the storm raged outside, the castle seemed to pulse with life, as if acknowledging the new alliance. The Alpha King and the Queen stood together in the tower, two souls entwined by power, destiny, and a challenge that would test them both beyond measure. The castle seemed to breathe with tension. Storms had battered the cliffs for days, and whispers of unrest reached even the tallest towers. Ilara felt the weight of the kingdom pressing on her, but she no longer feared the Alpha King's presence. She had learned to meet it, to match it with her courage, her heart, and her growing understanding of the man beneath the crown. The king had summoned her to the throne room at dawn. The air was thick with the scent of rain and the faint hum of old magic that lingered in the stones. His cloak trailed behind him like a shadow, and his eyes, dark, endless, and unreadable, studied her with the intensity of a storm. "You have endured much," he said, his voice calm yet heavy with authority. "But the trials are not over. There is a force gathering beyond these walls, one that seeks to test both the strength of this kingdom and the bond we share." Ilara straightened her spine, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I am ready," she said, though she did not know fully what she meant. She only knew that she would face whatever came, standing beside him, or at least attempting to. The king nodded, as if acknowledging her courage. "Very well. Tonight you will see what few mortals survive to witness. It is not only the enemy outside that threatens us, but the darkness within. To stand with me, you must confront it all. The power, the fear, the desire, and the cost." Hours later, the castle gates opened to a sky streaked with fire and shadow. A rival army advanced, but it was more than soldiers. They were creatures of the night, wraith-like beings born of ancient magic, intent on consuming life and will alike. Ilara's heart raced, yet she did not falter. She had trained, observed, and endured the king's subtle tests, and now she faced the culmination of all those lessons. The Alpha King stood beside her at the balcony, his hand brushing hers briefly, a touch that carried both command and reassurance. "Remember," he said, "courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to face it." Together they descended into the courtyard. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the swirling shadows and the determined faces of the knights who had sworn loyalty to the king. Ilara drew strength from the king's presence, feeling the pull of his power as it intertwined with her own resolve. The battle began with a roar. The king moved like a force of nature, commanding not only the knights but the elements themselves. Ilara, though untrained in the same raw force, used her insight and courage to navigate the chaos, protecting the weaker soldiers and guiding them through the shadows. She saw the king's eyes on her, approving and measuring every choice, and she felt a thrill of connection that strengthened her resolve. At one point, a creature surged forward, its form shifting like smoke and shadow. Ilara froze for a heartbeat, And then the king appeared beside her, deflecting it with a precise movement, his hand brushing hers again. The brief contact sent a spark through her, not of fear but of understanding. They were partners, bound not by command alone but by trust and heart. As the night deepened, the battle intensified. The king called forth torrents of energy from the stones beneath the castle, channeling his immense power to shield his people. Ilara, feeling the rhythm of his strength, used her own courage and empathy to reach those around her, guiding soldiers, calming fears, and even drawing some of the shadow creatures away with her voice and presence. Hours passed like moments. When the first light of dawn broke through the storm, the battlefield was quiet. The enemy had been repelled, not by strength alone but by unity, courage, and the bond between the king and his queen. Ilara stood beside him, breathing heavily, her cloak torn and her hands scratched, yet her heart was steady. The king turned to her, his eyes softer now though still intense. "You have endured more than any mortal should," he said. "And yet, you have endured with me. You have faced the darkness within and without, and you have emerged stronger. That is what it means to stand beside me." Ilara felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear but from the weight of recognition. She understood now the depth of his burden, the loneliness of his power, and the courage it took to carry it. And she realized that she had faced her own fears, her own shadows, and had emerged not only unbroken but changed. "You have changed me as well," the king admitted, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "I have walked these halls for centuries, commanding, ruling, fearing attachment, and yet in your presence I feel something I have not felt in a very long time, something that is neither command nor power, but connection." Ilara reached out, taking his hand fully this time. The touch was simple, yet it carried all the weight of their journey together. The tests, the tension, the growing trust, and the unspoken understanding. "And I have changed," she said softly. "I have learned that courage is not just facing others, but facing the heart of someone who seems untouchable. And I choose to face it." The king's lips curved into a rare smile, one that softened the shadows around him without diminishing his power. "Then we walk forward together," he said, "not as master and subject, but as partners. The kingdom is not the only thing that requires endurance. Our hearts do as well." For a moment the castle was silent, as if acknowledging this new alliance. The wind outside calmed and the sunlight reflected off the stones, casting golden light into the throne room. Ilara felt a profound sense of peace, not because the danger was gone, but because she had discovered something stronger than fear: trust, courage, and the bond of two hearts willing to endure together. Yet even in this moment of calm, a shadow lingered at the edges of the kingdom, watching, waiting. The Alpha King sensed it, a subtle shift in the air, a flicker in the stones beneath their feet. "We are not done," he murmured, almost to himself. "The trials are never truly over, but you have proven that you can endure with me." Ilara nodded, understanding that their journey was far from complete. The bond they shared, forged through tests of will, heart, and courage, was only the beginning. Together, they would face future storms, shadows, and challenges. Together, they would endure, transform, and perhaps even discover redemption, not only for the king, but for themselves. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the cliffs and the kingdom beyond. The Alpha King and his queen stood side by side, two figures united by courage and heart, their shadows stretching long and intertwined across the stones. The wind carried whispers of future challenges, yet they did not flinch. They had faced the darkness within and without, and they had emerged not only unbroken but strengthened. And in the quiet that followed, the king finally spoke words that were both command and promise. "You will take every inch with me, and I will meet you in every shadow. We will endure. Together." Ilara smiled softly, her heart steady. She had faced the Alpha King's world, his power and his heart. She had survived the shadows and the trials, and she had discovered the courage and strength that lay within her own spirit. And now, as they turned to face the horizon together, she understood the truth of what he had said all along. To endure, to love, and to transform, they must walk every step side by side. The castle seemed to breathe with approval, the stones echoing their resolve. The Alpha King and his queen had faced the ultimate trials of heart and spirit, emerging not only victorious but bound together in a bond forged by courage, understanding, and the quiet, unyielding power of love. And though the shadows beyond the cliffs remained, watching and waiting, the two of them stood unwavering, ready to face whatever came next, together.